Rachel Williams used to be the epitome of a perfect woman, always appearing beside her husband, David Williams, in the admiring eyes of neighbors and friends. They were seen as the ideal couple. Rachel was young and attractive, while David was intelligent and successful in running the family business. However, that perfect picture was only the surface of a marriage that had been slowly crumbling from the inside. David, Rachel's husband, inherited a well-known family company, but it was now facing a financial crisis. The pressure to save the company caused him to become distant and withdrawn. Once a loving and caring husband, David had become a shadow of his former self, always engrossed in work. He seemed constantly tense and avoided personal conversations with his wife, as if everything outside of work had become meaningless. Rachel, despite trying everything to rekindle her relationship with David, found herself increasingly disappointed and lonely. At 27 years old, she had once believed in a bright future when she married David, but reality had dimmed those early hopes. The strong connection they once had now been reduced to brief, awkward conversations, lacking the intimacy they once shared. In the evenings, Rachel often sat alone in the living room, gazing at the large and luxurious home they had built together. But now, the grand walls and expensive furniture no longer brought her joy, only loneliness and a sense of abandonment. Rachel knew that she and David had drifted apart, and the worst part was that she felt powerless to save the relationship. She wanted to escape, to find the love she had lost long ago. In her most vulnerable moments, Rachel turned to James, a man 5 years younger than her, who brought her the warmth and new joy she craved. Their secret meetings were a temporary escape from her suffocating reality. But deep down, she knew this was a dangerous path, that she was walking into a trap filled with peril. Rachel did not expect her life to become even more complicated when Victor Blackwood, David's uncle, began to take notice of her actions. Victor, a seasoned, powerful man, had been silently observing everything. His hidden feelings for Rachel soon became a threat she was unaware of. Rachel's life was about to enter a dangerous game, where secrets and lies would slowly be unveiled. Victor Blackwood, David's powerful uncle, was no ordinary man. At 58 years old, he controlled a vast fortune and a solid network of power. From a young age, Victor had learned to use cunning and manipulation to climb to the top of society, and now he was a figure no one dared to underestimate. To the public, Victor was a model of success and authority, but to those who had crossed paths with him, he was the embodiment of malice and calculation. Rachel always felt uneasy whenever Victor visited their home. His way of speaking was gentle, but it made her feel like she was being watched. Every time they met, Victor's gaze seemed to pierce through everything, as if he knew all her secrets. Lately, Rachel had clearly sensed that Victor was paying more attention to her than usual. Though they had never exchanged any direct words, Rachel always felt something inappropriate from Victor. Then, one evening, when David was away on a business trip, Victor unexpectedly visited Rachel at home. He arrived unannounced, like a predator aware that its prey was alone. Rachel sat in the living room, trying to remain calm as Victor entered. In his sleek black suit, he sat down in front of her, his eyes never leaving her face for even a second. The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze. Victor began, his voice full of sarcastic undertones. "Rachel, I've always known you were an intelligent and attractive woman. But perhaps you didn't realize that your steps have been watched for a long time." Rachel was taken aback, her body tensing. What are you talking about?" she stammered. "James," Victor emphasized, "the young man you thought you could keep hidden. Did you really believe I wouldn't find out about this? Someone like me, with all my connections at my fingertips." Rachel's heart raced. She knew her affair with James couldn't stay hidden forever, but she hadn't expected Victor to be the one to discover it. In that moment, Rachel clearly felt the danger from him, and the worst part was, she didn't know what to do next. Instead of showing anger, Victor seemed pleased with the situation. He gave a faint smile, then slowly continued, "You don't need to worry. I have no intention of exposing this. But you must understand, everything has a price." Rachel looked at Victor with confusion and fear in her eyes. She felt as if she had been caught in a trap from which there was no escape. Victor stood up and moved closer to Rachel. He didn't need to threaten her directly. His vague but sharp words made it clear to Rachel that she was now in the hands of a devil in disguise. Victor continued, "I can keep your secret, help you continue living the life you want. But in return, you'll have to do what I ask. From now on, you belong to me." Each word from Victor felt like a knife cutting deep into Rachel's mind. She couldn't resist. Fear, guilt, and helplessness overwhelmed her. Rachel knew she had entered a dangerous game with Victor, and from this moment on, her life would no longer be her own. She was trapped in the web of a manipulative, powerful man, and from now on, every step she took would be controlled by Victor. After the dark conversation with Victor, Rachel returned to her room with a heavy heart. Everything in her life, already unstable, had now become even more fragile. She realized she was not just facing the threat of her affair being exposed, but was also trapped in a power play where Victor held all the cards. Victor's veiled threats echoed in her mind, each word tightening the invisible chains around her, leaving her with no way out. In the days that followed, Victor began to make his first moves in manipulating Rachel's life. At first, he was gentle, asking her to attend family events with him, even occasionally placing his hand on her shoulder, signaling a relationship more intimate than necessary. Rachel felt uncomfortable, but she couldn't resist. Victor constantly reminded her that he held her secret, and that if she didn't comply with his wishes, everything would be exposed, and she would lose everything. But things didn't stop there. Victor began to pressure Rachel into meeting him in more private settings. He frequently texted her, asking her to come to his mansion to talk. Every time she stepped into that cold, grand mansion, Rachel felt like she was walking into a bottomless trap. Victor's room exuded authority and coldness, a place full of secrets Rachel never wanted to uncover. The early meetings were just conversations, but the atmosphere was always stifling and tense. Victor constantly reminded her that every move she made was under his control. As time passed, Victor's demands grew increasingly bizarre. He wanted Rachel to wear the clothes he chose, to follow his unreasonable wishes without ever questioning him. Each time Rachel tried to protest, Victor quickly extinguished any hope by reminding her of the consequences if her secret were exposed. Victor even began to demand things that made Rachel feel disgusted, but she had no choice but to agree, just to maintain the fragile stability of her marriage to David. Rachel spiraled into a cycle of fear and self-loathing. Every night, as she lay next to David, she no longer felt like herself. Lies and deceit had turned her into someone else. Rachel questioned what she had done to deserve such a price. She was no longer the independent, strong woman she once was, but a puppet in Victor's hands. Every decision, every action had to follow his will. As time went on, Victor grew bolder. He no longer stopped at small requests, but began to control every aspect of Rachel's life. She couldn't even meet friends or family without reporting to Victor. He turned her into someone completely dependent, a prisoner of his subtle manipulation, and she didn't know how to escape. The tension in Rachel's mind mounted every day. She felt she could no longer endure, but every way out seemed blocked by Victor. Her life became a series of lies and fears, a game she could no longer control. However, deep within, Rachel began to hatch a plan. She knew she couldn't continue living like this forever. One day, she would have to confront Victor, to find a way to regain control of her life. But before that could happen, she had to accept the reality that she was trapped in a web full of dangers, where one wrong move could lead to total ruin. Rachel thought she had hit rock bottom when Victor completely controlled her life. But she had no idea that things would get even worse than she imagined. She had long trusted James, the man who had brought her joy and love during her lonely days. But James had gradually distanced himself, mysteriously disappearing without a word. Rachel tried calling him many times, but his phone was always busy, and her messages were never answered. From worrying about him, Rachel began to feel suspicious. One evening, while sitting in Victor's dark room, Rachel decided she had to find out the truth about James. She sensed something was wrong. Victor seemed to know too much about her relationship with James, but how could he have such detailed knowledge of every meeting they had? To satisfy her curiosity, Rachel began to secretly follow Victor, knowing he must be hiding something. Then one day, while searching through Victor's office while he was away, Rachel stumbled upon a file buried deep in a locked drawer. Inside, she was shocked to find a series of emails and messages between Victor and James. The messages were not just casual conversations between two men, but revealed that they had been secretly working together for a long time. James wasn't the secret lover Rachel had believed. He was a tool in Victor's plan to manipulate her. Rachel's vision darkened as she read the cunning, deceitful messages. "Keep fooling her," Victor wrote. "She has no suspicion. Let her believe you love her. When the time is right, we'll have her do everything we want." James responded coldly and nonchalantly, with no sign of remorse. From the beginning, everything had been meticulously arranged. Rachel was just a pawn in Victor's grand scheme. Rachel trembled all over, feeling utterly betrayed. She had trusted James, thinking he was the one to help her escape the stifling life with David and Victor's control. But in reality, James was nothing but a traitor, someone she should never have trusted. Everything she had built and hoped for collapsed in an instant. Rachel collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. She felt like a doll being manipulated by invisible hands. Every decision, every emotion she had experienced over the past months had been part of Victor and James's game. Those two men had controlled and steered her life in the direction they wanted, leaving her completely trapped. In the hours that followed, Rachel fell into an inner crisis. She questioned herself, wondering how she could have been so blind. How had she not seen the signs of James's deception? But then she realized that Victor had calculated everything. He had known how to exploit her pain and loneliness, how to make her trust James, how to turn her life into a labyrinth with no exit. From that moment on, all of Rachel's feelings changed. Pain and fear slowly gave way to anger and hatred. She knew she couldn't let Victor and James continue to manipulate her life. Rachel decided she had to do something to regain control, to escape from this spiral of guilt and deceit. But she also knew this wouldn't be easy, because both Victor and James were too dangerous. A plan began to form in Rachel's mind. She wouldn't run anymore, but would confront everything. She would have to find a way to turn the tables, and this time, she wouldn't allow herself to become a victim again. Rachel had been betrayed enough, and now she was ready to do whatever it took to claim justice for herself. After discovering the shocking truth about James, Rachel was determined to regain control of her life. But she knew that to do so, she had to escape from Victor, the man who held all her secrets and her life in his hands. However, Victor had anticipated every move, and before Rachel had a chance to act, he pushed her into an unforeseen situation. Victor, realizing that Rachel was starting to resist him, decided to increase the pressure on her. He began sowing doubt and discord between Rachel and David. One evening, Victor suddenly asked Rachel to meet him at a small cafe, where he had prepared a carefully thought-out plan. As Rachel sat across from Victor, he calmly said, "David is beginning to suspect you, Rachel. He's talked to me several times about your recent behavior. I haven't told him about James, but that doesn't mean he doesn't know." Rachel was stunned. "What are you talking about?" "David suspects me," Victor smirked, his eyes cold and sharp like a hawk's. "David isn't a fool. He's noticed the changes in you. The time you've spent on secret meetings, the unexplained phone calls. All I have to do is say one word, and everything will blow up." Rachel tried to remain calm, but every word from Victor felt like a stab to her heart. She knew he was telling the truth lately. David had indeed become distant and seemed suspicious of everything she did. But Victor's manipulation of David only made things worse. He had set the stage, just waiting for Rachel to walk into the trap. Victor continued his psychological assault. "Rachel, you need to understand one thing: you can't escape me. If you try, I'll not only destroy your marriage, but I'll also make you a traitor in David's eyes. You know he'll never forgive you if he finds out the truth. Think about that before you do something foolish." Rachel sat there, listening to Victor's sweet threats, feeling like every escape route was being sealed off. Victor wasn't just manipulating her. He was now controlling both her and David's thoughts and actions. Every time David looked at her with suspicion, Rachel knew Victor had done exactly what he promised. As time went on, David's suspicion grew. Rachel tried to explain, tried to maintain her image in David's eyes, but all her efforts were in vain. David began asking about the days she was away, about the unexpected phone calls she refused to explain. Each of David's questions was filled with doubt and coldness. Rachel felt she was losing both her husband and her life. Victor seemed to derive pleasure from Rachel's pain. He didn't stop there, but created situations to further drive Rachel and David apart. One afternoon, Victor sent David an anonymous email, hinting at Rachel's relationship with a secret man. This threw David into a state of confusion, and things got worse when he began to follow his wife. Rachel discovered this when David suddenly appeared at a gathering with friends that she hadn't mentioned to him. David said nothing, just quietly sat down, but his eyes were filled with suspicion and doubt. Rachel felt like she was being surrounded, observed by the very person she had once trusted most. Every night, when David came home, the atmosphere between them grew more suffocating. The tension mounted, and although Rachel tried her best to stay calm, she knew their relationship was on the brink of collapse. Victor had succeeded in planting the seeds of doubt in David's mind. Rachel felt trapped between two jaws. One was Victor, who was manipulating her, and the other was David, who was gradually losing faith in her. She knew she had to do something, but every move led to danger. If she tried to escape, Victor would expose all her secrets. But if she did nothing, she would lose both David and her freedom. Rachel stood before a difficult decision, realizing she needed to find a way to resolve the situation before things spiraled out of control. After discovering the painful truth about James, Rachel could no longer trust anyone around her. But Victor didn't give her time to process this shock. He quickly acted, tightening his control over her life and using the fragile relationship between Rachel and David as a dangerous weapon. Victor knew that Rachel's marriage to David was on the verge of collapse, and he decided to accelerate the process. Each time they met, he spoke about David with a tone full of mockery, planting doubts in Rachel's mind. "Do you think David still trusts you? He's suspicious of you." The mysterious phone calls, the times you've been out without explanation." "He's already talked to me about it," Victor said, his tone calm but filled with authority. Rachel sat across from him, her heart racing. Every word from Victor felt like a dagger piercing her heart, making her more anxious. What Victor said wasn't entirely wrong. Recently, David had indeed changed. He spoke less, often looking at her with cold, distant eyes. And now, through Victor's words, she understood that this change was no accident. It was the result of a deeper plot. "David will never forgive you if he finds out the truth. He'll destroy you," Victor continued, his eyes cold. "But I can help you. I can make sure David never finds out anything. But you have to follow my orders." Rachel knew she was being cornered. She understood that Victor wasn't just threatening her present life, but was also destroying the fragile relationship between her and David. She couldn't face David knowing about James, about everything she had done. But at the same time, she couldn't continue living under Victor's control. As time went on, Victor didn't just talk. He began to act, using subtle manipulation to drive a wedge between Rachel and David. One afternoon, David suddenly appeared at a meeting Rachel hadn't told him about. His eyes were probing, and the atmosphere between them grew more suffocating than ever. Rachel knew Victor was behind it all, orchestrating every move she and David made. Victor also didn't hesitate to send anonymous emails to David, hinting at dark secrets in Rachel's life. Each message was like a drop of poison in their relationship, pushing David further away and making him more suspicious. Rachel couldn't explain, and each time she tried, David became colder, his eyes filled with doubt. Every night, Rachel lay next to David, but the distance between them felt endless. She no longer recognized the man she had once loved. Victor had succeeded in sowing the seeds of doubt in David's mind. Rachel could feel the impending collapse, and the worst part was, she didn't know how to fix it. Trapped in the conflict between Victor and David, Rachel felt like she was losing everything. Everything was spiraling out of control, and she knew that if she didn't act soon, she would lose not only her marriage, but also her life. But how could she fight someone like Victor when everything was in his hands? That was the question Rachel knew she had to answer before it was too late. Rachel felt everything was slipping out of control. David was becoming more distant and suspicious, while Victor tightened his grip on her life. Every day that passed, Rachel realized she had been pushed to her limits. The threats, the manipulation, and the fear made her feel trapped in a maze with no way out. But a spark of resolve lit up in Rachel. She knew she had to confront Victor before everything completely collapsed. She couldn't continue being controlled. This thought drove her to plan one final meeting with Victor to end everything, even though she didn't know how it would turn out. She needed to face him, no matter the danger. That night, Rachel called Victor and asked to meet him at his mansion. It was the place where Victor always felt most powerful, but Rachel had no other choice. As she stepped into the grand but cold mansion, a sense of fear welled up, but Rachel was determined. Victor was waiting in his office, looking relaxed and confident. He smiled when he saw her. "Rachel, you came at just the right time. I knew you'd have to come to me eventually." Rachel could feel the smugness in Victor's words. She knew he believed he was still in complete control. But this time, Rachel didn't intend to let him manipulate her any longer. "Victor, I can't go on like this anymore," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice calm, but unable to hide the tension in her words. "I won't let you control my life any longer." Victor looked at Rachel with cold eyes. He smirked, as if her words carried no weight. "You think you can escape me, Rachel? You really believe it will be that simple?" He stood up, moving closer to Rachel, his voice full of menace. "If you try to leave me, I will destroy everything you have. David will know everything. You'll lose everything." Rachel's heart pounded, but instead of letting fear take over, she faced Victor. "I've already lost too much, Victor. But this time, I won't let you win. If you plan to reveal my secret, then do it. I'm not afraid anymore." Victor stopped in his tracks, surprise flashing in his eyes. He hadn't expected Rachel to dare challenge him like that. Rachel sensed his unease, and that was her opportunity. "You thought you could control me forever, but you were wrong. I won't be your victim anymore," Rachel continued. "You've ruined my life, my marriage, and I have nothing left to lose. But you do. You've played a dangerous game, and now you'll have to pay the price." Victor clenched his fists, clearly struggling to contain his anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Rachel. You have no power here." Rachel stepped back, her eyes filled with determination. "Yes, I used to be weak, but I'm not anymore." The confrontation continued, tense and fraught. Victor tried to maintain the upper hand, but Rachel was no longer a puppet in his hands. She was ready to stand up to him, and Victor began to feel he was losing control. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the office burst open. David appeared, his eyes full of shock and confusion. He had heard everything. Rachel and Victor both stood frozen, stunned by his presence. The secret Victor had threatened to expose had now come out, but in a way he hadn't anticipated. David stood at the door, his eyes wide in disbelief as he looked at Rachel and Victor. The room suddenly felt more suffocating than ever. Rachel had been facing Victor's threats, and now David couldn't understand what had happened. The truth about her relationship with James was now exposed, and everything seemed to have completely fallen apart. In that tense moment, James suddenly entered the room, his face showing clear rage. Rachel felt the danger in his eyes. James quickly moved toward Victor, unable to control his growing anger. "This ends here, Victor," James shouted, pulling a gun from inside his coat. Rachel panicked, backing away as she saw James raise the gun, pointing it directly at Victor. "James, don't do it." Rachel screamed, but no one could react in time. A shot rang out, echoing through the room. Victor staggered and collapsed to the floor, blood spreading from a wound on his chest. But before James could move, Victor suddenly pulled out a gun hidden in his desk and fired back. James was hit in the chest, falling to the floor next to Victor. Rachel stood frozen, her whole body trembling, her terror-filled eyes staring at the two men lying motionless on the floor. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the police after hearing the gunshots. In her panic, Rachel accidentally touched the gun as she knelt down to check James' pulse. When the police stormed into the room, they found Rachel next to the two bodies, still holding the gun. Before she could explain, the police handcuffed her and took her away. All Rachel could do was pray that the truth would come to light during the investigation. At the police station, Rachel was taken into an interrogation room, the dim light from the ceiling lamp making the atmosphere even more tense. She sat across from the detectives, her heart filled with panic and despair. They bombarded her with questions demanding that she explain what had happened. Rachel recounted the entire story, from being manipulated by Victor to her complex relationship with James and all the events leading up to that tragic night. She tried to explain that she wasn't the one who killed Victor, but the fact that she was at the scene and holding the gun made the situation more difficult. The detectives reviewed the evidence and conducted further investigations at the scene. The gun had Rachel's fingerprints on it, but through forensic analysis, they discovered that James had shot Victor, and Victor's second gun was the cause of James' death. However, Rachel's presence at the scene and the psychological manipulation she had suffered from Victor were also considered. The case quickly drew media attention. The press constantly reported on the bloody love triangle and Rachel's role in the situation. Some people saw Rachel as a victim of Victor's manipulation, while others viewed her as an accomplice in the crime. When the case went to trial, Rachel's lawyer argued that she had been a victim of psychological manipulation and abuse by Victor. Rachel had been mentally controlled by him for a long time and had no intention of harming anyone. They also presented evidence that Rachel hadn't directly fired the gun and highlighted her state of panic after the incident. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that Rachel had done nothing to stop the escalating violence, and her presence at the scene, along with her holding the gun, made her partly responsible. In the end, the jury did not convict Rachel of murder, but they concluded that she bore some responsibility for Victor's death due to her failure to act to prevent the violence and her failure to report what she knew. Rachel was convicted of involuntary manslaughter with mitigating factors due to the psychological manipulation she had suffered from Victor. With these mitigating factors, Rachel received a sentence of 5 years in prison, but it was suspended with 3 years of probation and mandatory psychological counseling to address the mental trauma she had endured. David, after hearing the verdict, had no hope left for their marriage. He decided to divorce Rachel, feeling that he could not continue the relationship after all the truths had been revealed. Rachel walked out of the courtroom with an uncertain future ahead. She knew her life had changed forever, and although she had avoided a harsher sentence, the psychological scars and pain would haunt her for the rest of her life.